So my name's Suzanne. I'm going to be talking about becoming an accessibility-focused developer, or a bit more accurately, about starting on that journey to becoming a bit more accessibility-focused. Before I start, I just want to point out on the slide, you'll see a link at the bottom right-hand corner. That has all the slides at it, but it also has a lot of resources. So anything that I'm linking to or talking about at the talk, you can find a link to it at that slide. So it's bits.ly/A11y-focus-developer. If you haven't seen the term A11y before, it's basically just a short form for accessibility. So it's the first letter and the last letter, and the 11 stands for the 11 letters that are missing in between. So there you go. Fun fact. So I'm just going to start off by saying accessibility is everybody's responsibility. And by that, I don't really mean like everyone in this room. I mean everyone in your organization. For an app to be usable by the most number of people, accessibility has to be thought about at every part of the product development lifecycle. So everything from just what the app is in the first place, like what is the idea, to the user research, the design, the coding, the testing, all of it. But if you're just one person, that is a lot of people that you're going to have to convince to get on board with accessibility. And I can tell you now that if you start talking about accessibility in your organization, the chances are you're going to hear a lot of bad takes. So you're going to hear things like, I'm sorry, but accessibility isn't part of the MVP. You're going to hear, just put a ticket in the backlog, please. The subtext to that is where it will live forever. And my personal favorite, which is absolutely 100% something I've been told many times, but we don't have any disabled users. And of course you don't, because they can't use your app. So, I mean, these type of things are unfortunately really common. They're really dismissive, and they're also very ableist. Like, it is a true privilege to be able to care so little about accessibility. A lot of people don't have that luxury. And so I guess while I really do encourage you to advocate for accessibility in your organizations, I do. But this talks more about what you as an individual developer can control. And what we can control is that one small piece, which is the implementation. So on an average day, you're probably picking up a ticket that might have been defined by somebody else in terms of the acceptance criteria. You're going to do a bit of dev work, you're going to push it to review, maybe you'll fix a few things, maybe you'll review some other people's tickets. And that's really where your control lies. So this is where we can start making changes in our habits and build habits that are going to help us learn more accessibility and also improve the accessibility of the apps that we build. So the habits that we're going to be talking about. We're going to look at how we can detect some common issues, specifically with linting. So nice and easy linting. We're going to look at every time you pick up a piece of work, are there some quick win refactoring things that you can do that can just add a little bit more accessibility into what you're doing, but don't take a lot of time. And we're going to talk about how you can learn more by finding your own bugs, because I think that's the main thing to take away, is that the way that you can learn is by just figuring out what you're doing wrong in the first place. So first up, linting. Chances are that nearly everyone in this room that's working on sort of production projects is using ESLint. And there's a great plugin that you can use with that, ESLint plugin JSX Ali or A11y. It's just an NPM package that you can extend your ESLint config with, and it's going to help you catch a lot of very common errors before they make it anywhere near production. So things like checking that if you've used an image element, have you put meaningful alternative text on it? And by meaningful, I mean like it's going to check that you have alternative text, but you also haven't made the alternative text things like image. Which you'd be surprised how often you write things like, it's an image of a cat. And it's like, they know it's an image. Just tell them it's a cat. It's going to check for things like, have you got labels for your inputs? That's super, super important. And also that if you have those labels, are they linked to the input properly? Because sometimes visually it looks okay, but it'll flag it up if you haven't actually linked it correctly. And also things like, have you added an on-click handler to an element that isn't interactive or reachable by the keyboard? probably because you don't have the tab index property on it. Stuff like that's really useful. That's just an example of what it looks like. It's probably no surprise to anyone who's using ESLint. So in this example, there's an input, there's a label, but they're not linked together. So it's flagging up an issue. Form label must have an associated control. And like a lot of ESLint sort of errors and warnings, there's a quick fix option. So quite a lot of the time, you're going to be able to fix some issues just by clicking quick fix and yes, please. So it's definitely not going to take a lot of time. It does require going through code review probably because you're adding a package to your project, but hopefully it's not very controversial. It's just linting. So that's our first line of defense. Next thing I'm going to talk about is about refactoring quick wins, because I guess we could spend a really long time on the code that we're working on to make it as perfect as possible. But the reality is you probably have a deadline, there's things that have to move across the board, there's releases happening, and if your organization isn't really on board, you probably don't have a lot of time to spend on refactoring. So it's just a couple of things that I think are sort of low effort, high reward. And the first one is, in the code that you've written, are there any divs that don't need to be divs? And I'm sure the answer is probably yes. So the reason for that, so as W3C say, authors are strongly encouraged to view the div element as an element of last resort for when there's absolutely no other element. And the reason for that is because on their own, divs have no semantic value whatsoever. They have nothing. And HTML semantics are what assistive technology used to look at the browser, look at what's there, help understand our content, and then surface it to users. So if there's a more semantic alternative, let's use it. In some cases, it might be things like you've got a div with some text in, you can change it to a paragraph, awesome, nice and easy. Some elements that I think are a little bit underused are landmarks. So if we use landmarks, there's a benefit to screen reader users that they can actually skip to the content they're looking for a lot more easily. So when I talk about landmarks, I'm talking about things like the header, the footer, nav, main, aside, section. Some are used pretty well, some are really underused, and I'm just going to take you on a quick tour through some of them. So header, it maps to the ARIA landmark of banner. The name banner isn't too important, but it's more just to let you know that like, if you did switch a screen reader on and you were in this section, it would be surfaced as a banner, not a header. They're essentially the same. I'm sure nearly every project we're working on has a header and you know what it's for, so I'm just going to skip over it. And you have footer, which maps to the landmark of content info, which when you think about it makes a bit of sense because it probably has things like a link to your privacy policy, copyright notice, things like that. You should only have one of them. It's going to live at about the same level as your header. Nav maps to navigation, and you can use that to wrap lists of links on your page. And the benefit to that is that if a user is using a screen reader, they're maybe in the middle of your page or they're at the bottom, but they want to go to somewhere else in your app, they can go straight to your navigation and they can find those links really easily instead of having to like search all around your page for them. You can have more than one nav. So if you've got two sets of navigation, like in the header, but also maybe some breadcrumbs or something, you can have two, you can have three, you can have four. But if you do have more than one, consider giving them a label, because then the screen reader user knows which one is which, and they know which one they're trying to go to. And we have main landmark, which maps to main, nice and simple. I think this one's really underused in my experience. I don't know why though. So it wraps the main content of your page. And the benefit there is hopefully clear, because if a user can go directly to these landmarks, it means they can go directly to the main content that you're trying to surface to them without going through the 100 links in your header, any asides, things like that. So I think there's a bit of a win-win benefit there, because you're getting your content to them more easily and they're getting to what they want more easily. There should only be one of them on your page. Like the word main is definitive. It's either main or it's not main. So only one. And linked to that is the aside element. Aside element is probably not something we'd use in every project. It maps to the complementary landmark, which is the name I like the most, because I think it describes what it does very well. So the complementary sits outside of your main, and it complements the main. So it's content that's not part of your absolute main content, but it adds additional information. So you probably see it used for things like, here's related links to this topic, or here's other stories about this topic. You can have more than one, much like a nav. Just give them a label if you have to. And the last one I wanted to mention was section, which is a bit of a special case because it doesn't always map to a landmark. It only maps to a landmark if you do give it a label. It's one that you might want to use if within your main content you have a section that really can stand alone, like it can be understood in isolation from the rest of your main content, and you want users to be able to get to it more easily. So that's one way that you can get rid of a lot of divs. The other one, and I think me personally, I'm guilty of this as a React developer, and I think other React developers might be as well, is ensure that the lists that are in your app are actually lists. So I think quite often we take data from APIs, we map it to a bunch of divs, make it look really pretty, and we spit it out on the page. But they're probably meant to be lists. And the benefit of actually using the UL and LI elements is that a screen reader user, when they come to it, they're going to know how many items are in that list. Where are they in that list at the moment? And I think most importantly, do they want to read the whole list? Because if there's 50 items and they don't know there's 50 items, yeah, they're probably not going to enjoy that. So it's definitely a quick win. Just add it to. And yeah, the golden rule, if you use map to create a set of elements, they're probably meant to be list items. Not always, but generally speaking. So now we've got some more semantics into our app. Second priority, I would say, is to audit your headings. And the reason I say that is because when WebAIM did a survey of screen reader users, they asked them, what's the first thing that you do when you land on a page? And a huge majority of respondents said, I'm going to navigate by headings. And when I say navigate by headings, what I mean is like this. So this example is using VoiceOver on Mac. It's pulling up a list of all the headings on the page. And this is the React Edinburgh meetup page. I don't know if you recognize any of these headings. So there's an H1 that's React Edinburgh, brilliant. It tells you what the page is about. There's a heading 2, what we're about, heading 3, upcoming events, heading 3, past events, and many, many, many more. But what the user can do is they can select one of those and skip directly to that content. So you start to see that if I'm coming to this page and I'm looking for when the next React meetup is, I can get to it straight away. I don't have to read through all the content on the page to find where that is. And I mean, this is a good example because there are a lot of headings and it was really easy to find what I wanted as a user. I'm just going to put it out there as a little aside. I'm not really saying you'd have to do this often, but if you do receive a really minimalist design and the designer is like, no, it's super important that we don't have any headings whatsoever, it has happened. You can put a hidden one on the page if you want. Like if you think that that's something that's important, you can add it in and you can just display it off screen with some CSS. And I'd say when you start a project, this is a good chunk of CSS just to have in your back pocket at all times, because quite often it's really useful to be able to add something to the page that isn't visible, but is perceivable by a screen reader user. But what I really wanted to say about headings is to think about the heading levels in terms of the structure that they give the page instead of what they look like. Because I think we're often quite guilty of taking a design, looking at the headings and saying, it's about this size, it's like a H4. Yeah, looks right, job's a good one. But the heading levels have a semantic meaning. And I've got a little example that I've just made this up, it's not a real website. So in the example, we've got an H1 that says, find a pet for adoption. Great, I know what the page is about. I also know it's for me. Great. There's an H2, meet our dogs. I'm going to guess that content is about dogs for adoption. An H2, meet our cats. I'm going to guess it's about cats. And then another H2 that's new arrivals. What is it about? I'm going to guess it's about cats and dogs and maybe rabbits. I don't know. I'm not sure what it's about, but it's at the same level as the other items. So I don't think it's specific to either of them. Whereas if we change that to an H3, now we can understand that new arrivals sits inside the heading of Meet Our Cats. It's like a subsection. And so I know it's just cats. So if I'm looking for a cat, and I've been looking for a cat for ages, and I just want to know what the newest cats are, I can find it straight away. And I've laid this out using a list with indentation to give a bit of a visual cue to understanding it. That's really how I think about it, is like a file structure almost, or a document outline, which is literally what it is, I guess. But it's just important to remember that users who can't see or can't see very well, they don't have that visual cue. And all they have is the number to go by. So it is really helpful if you think about, are my heading levels actually where I want them to be? So a couple of rules to take away: only one H1 per page. And that's because, much like the main content, that's what's telling the user this is what this page is about. So it's confusing to have two. And then if you need to sort of nest inside into a subsection, just increase the heading level by 1. That's it. So we've done a bit of refactoring, and hopefully that's improved the accessibility of our app a little bit. But the main thing that we can do to get better at accessibility and to bring a bit more of an accessibility focus to our work is to start finding our bugs, because we are going to make them. And the first line of defense that we've got is to use a browser extension to help us do that. Two of the most popular ones that I've linked to there are Axe and Wave. They're available for Firefox and Chrome. There's a lot of other ones as well. A lot of them are built upon Axe Core, but maybe just try some out and see which one you like the user interface of. I personally prefer Axe. It's up to you. And what they're going to do is, they're much like a lint, they're going to help us catch common errors, but they're going to help us catch things that ESLint can't. So things that can only be checked once you've rendered your content. So things like, how is the color contrast? Are users going to be able to see this? Now that I've got all my different components and all my JavaScript is run, like, do the heading levels make sense? Now that all my components are together on the page, have I accidentally got two main landmarks? Do I not have one at all? Lots and lots of useful stuff. And it looks a little bit like this. You probably can't read what it says, but don't worry about it. It's basically just a list of errors on the React Edinburgh meetup page, which I blame Meetup for, is Meetup's problem. And what you can do, this is Axe that we're looking at the minute, but they're all very similar in their functionality. You can filter by the severity of the issue. So a lot of these are just going to be warnings. They're not going to be actual violations. So you can filter by severity. You can ask it to highlight on the page where the problem is so that you can see where it is. You can click to go directly to the HTML node causing the problem so you can start to debug it. And I think most importantly, it has links out to hints and resources about how to fix it. So you can start to see that if we just start running these checks, even if we can't fix every single thing every single time, we're going to start learning about what the problems are that we might be creating and what to avoid in future. But these kind of automated checking tools can only get us so far. Some things do have to be checked manually, and there's a couple of manual checks I would recommend doing. And the first is just checking that your work is operable by keyboard alone. Keyboard navigation, really essential for accessibility. And I think as developers, we're kind of used to using the keyboard to get around and to find shortcuts. So hopefully it's something that will feel quite natural just to quickly check before you push something up for review. But what to check for? So just check that you can get to every interactive element. And by interactive, I mean things like buttons and links, but I also mean things that you can hover over for more content, anything that there would be like a mouse action associated for. So you just hit tab to go forward, shift tab to go backwards. If you can't get to any of your interactive items, the chances are the reason is you've used a div. Just saying. As you're tabbing through, check that where the focus is visible, because it's really easy to get lost if you're tabbing through elements. If you can't see it, then that's a problem. And I've got a little example from the React Edinburgh meetup page. So I'm just going to try and hit play. Oh, we've gone back. One sec. Hopefully it's going to play. Oh, no. Oh, yeah, it is playing. It's just not on my screen. So you'll see the blue focus outline moving around, and that's great. And then eventually it's going to get to the big red join this group button, and it's going to go. And then eventually it's going to pop back up. There is a very subtle focus style on those buttons. There is. I've checked carefully, but I had to check by the code to find it. And the reason that's happened is because the developer who did this has overridden the default focus style. They've actively broken this, but I guess they probably didn't check in the browser that they could still see what they'd replaced it with. So if you do change the focus style, just make sure you can see it. It's as simple as that. As you're tabbing through the items, just check that the order that you're tabbing through them feels logical. And normally by that I mean sort of top to bottom, left to right, especially in this country. I've got a short demo of a bad example, which I did have to invent myself. So you see it goes from the header link to the footer to everything in the aside, and finally to the main content, which isn't what you would expect, I'm sure. And the reason it does that is because I coded it that way. So I literally declared the header first, then the footer, then the aside, then the main. It's a very simplistic example, but the point I'm trying to make is that the order you declare your JSX matters, even if visually it looks okay. And this is a really, really basic example that I'm sure we're never going to make this mistake with these 4 elements. But if you've got a lot of responsive layouts, and if you've got things laid out in multiple directions with like CSS grid or with Flexbox, it's actually very possible that you're going to skew the tab order. It's a very natural thing to accidentally do. And that check, tabbing through, takes about 20 seconds at most. And the fix is normally just to shift the order. So it's a really nice quick fix item to catch. And lastly, just test that you can interact with those elements once you've gotten to them. You know, can you click the link by just hitting enter? Do things do what you expect them to do? If it opens a pop-up, can you get back out of the pop-up? That's a very common one. And if you fix any of the errors that you find doing those keyboard checks, you've actually gone a really long way to improving the accessibility of your app. So definitely quick win, high reward. And the last one, check your code works for screen reader users. And you might be thinking at this point, seriously, for like every piece of work I do, am I really going to check with a screen reader? I'd agree. I actually don't think it's always necessary. But I have one golden rule, and that's if you used an ARIA attribute, you should definitely be checking your code with a screen reader. So ARIA attributes, like ARIA label, for example, have the power to override other semantics on the page, and they're only really surfaced to screen reader users. So if you're adding them into your code, but you're not turning on the screen reader, how have you checked that it worked? You haven't. And when WebAIM did a survey of the top 1 million websites, they found that homepages that had examples of ARIA use in it had way higher accessibility failings than those without. So as an absolute minimum, if you used ARIA, check it with a screen reader. And I'm just going to reiterate here that I'm talking about as developers doing individual pieces of work, this is the minimum. I think it's a whole different story if we're talking about testers doing regression passes or release passes. Then I think screen reader checks are essential. But as developers, the reality is we don't have time. Sometimes there's not a value to it. But if you used ARIA, that's a minimum. More often is better. So if you're going to get started with doing screen reader checks, the first thing to do is to choose a screen reader and browser combination that makes sense. And by makes sense, I mean it works on your computer, they're designed to work together, and they're a combination that your users are probably using. So if you're on Windows, I would recommend NVDA as the screen reader. It's a free download. And Firefox, mostly because I don't like the IE system. If you're on Mac OS, you already have VoiceOver and Safari out of the box on your Mac. And once you've got your setup going, I'd say just focus on 3 things. Learn how to switch it on and off. And I know that sounds really basic, but I know from personal experience that the main thing that put me off switching my screen reader on for these checks was the fear that I was going to be stuck with it on, and I was going to be in the middle of the office and it was going to be announcing all my failed attempts to switch it off. So the sooner you get comfortable with switching it off and on, the better. On VoiceOver, it's just Command F5 to do both. So I promise you, if you manage to switch it on, you know how to switch it off. Promise. Once you have it on, just check that you can read parts of the page. So on VoiceOver, you can use Control Option, the right arrow to go forwards, left to go back. That's just going to read small sections of the content a piece at a time. And then test that you can interact with items. You can even just use your tab key to get there when you're doing your keyboard checks. Control Option Spacebar will execute the default action for that item, so like clicking on a link, opening a drop-down. And that's it really. Like if you just do those 3 things, you're going to be able to check a lot of the basics of the code that you've written. And once you get comfortable with those commands and you don't have to look them up every time, it's actually not going to take very long. And if you fix the issues that you find, it's pretty accessible. So just to round things up, we've kind of got a new pre-push checklist before you send your code off for code review. So we're going to refactor for some better semantics if we can and check the heading structure makes sense. We're going to just run a quick check with a browser extension like Axe or Wave, check with the keyboard, check with the screen reader sometimes. And with practice, those things aren't going to be like a checklist, like a laundry list of things you have to go through. They're just going to embed into your general approach towards the way you code. You're going to stop using divs when you don't need divs. You're going to start thinking when you look at a design, how does this work with the keyboard? And then eventually that's going to influence the code reviews you do as well. And that's going to influence the other developers that you're code reviewing. And it's going to inform your conversations with designers, and you're going to be asking them, well, actually, where's the heading levels in this? Or how does this work with the keyboard? And gradually there will be a small ripple out effect to other parts of your organization without you having to sort of stand up and shout about accessibility all the time. And that's where I'm going to leave it. So everything that I've mentioned is in the link to the slides. It's got the resources as well. I run a website called upyouralley.com or Up Your A11y if you hate puns. It's up to you what you want to call it. And that has a lot of tutorials and resources, a lot of which are aimed specifically at React developers with React implementations.